Just by way of introduction, my thesis actually looks at Jews, Sikhs, Catholics, and Muslim men and women. And it's really important to note that actually in cartoons, there's a clear focus on men and women with the Muslim community. But when it comes to other faith groups, they are almost all, if not wholly, represented by men. I'm going to start off by looking at women, and then I'll look at men. And it's important to note that in the cartoons, the burqa, which I define as the one-piece veil covering the entire body, but leaving the face clear, and the niqab, which is also the one-piece veil covering the entire body, but covering the face, leaving the eyes clear, are used interchangeably to reflect attitudes towards the oppression of women, towards attitudes of towards democracy and freedom of speech, which displays an ignorance towards the different concepts of veiling within Islam. But I'm going to use the word burqa just for ease throughout my presentation. Okay, so this first cartoon was published following the collapse of the Taliban regime. And one of the most important things was the fact that women were allowed to work, vote, and be educated, whereas once they weren't under the Taliban regime. And so here in this cartoon, Paul Thomas is showing how Afghan men and women don't have to wear the burqa, or they don't have to grow their beards anymore. And despite being amongst the rubble of the war, they're actually pictured as being very happy because of their freedom to wear what they want. This next cartoon, again, is about the collapse of the Taliban regime. And here what's interesting is actually we have a juxtaposition of an Afghan street seller in traditional clothing, Afghan clothing, which, apologies for my awful pronunciation, which is known as a perhon tunban. And he whistles at the two women who, for want of a better word, are wearing Western clothing. So, and one of the women uses a very odd turn of phrase, burqa off mate. And I think what's interesting is that actually here, their attire reflects their attitudes towards gender. So whereas the traditional Afghan seller has perhaps quite traditional views towards women, the women wearing the Western clothing have perhaps more liberal views. And that's demonstrated by what they are wearing. And I think what's one of the key things is that both cartoons really focus on the liberation of women as an outcome of the fall of the Taliban. And I think actually the previous cartoon, Paul Thomas's cartoon, perhaps goes so far as to belittle the human cost of the war, because they're probably standing in the rubble of their own homes, and yet they're still happy because they can just wear whatever they like. Now, this cartoon was published following an interview by the then Business Secretary, Vince Cable, and he likened the Bank of England's fiscal policies to the Taliban. A few months earlier, the Bank of England announced that they would be replacing Elizabeth Fry with that of Winston Churchill, and that meant there'd be no females on Bank of England notes. So this cartoon puts the two issues together, and it comments on the subsequent decision by the Bank of England to feature Jane Austen, which has recently come into circulation. What's interesting is that by cloaking Jane Austen in a burqa, it specifically connects the Muslim religion with gender inequality. So despite the fact that Austen would never have dressed as such, despite the fact that Islam nor the Taliban had any influence in the Bank of England's decision not to feature any women other than the Queen, the fact is that Peter Brooks chooses to look at this issue in this way. And I think one of the key things as well to take away from this is that whilst many commentators talk about the Rushdie affair in 1988 and the controversy caused by the publication of Satanic Verses, and how key that was in the formation of the British Muslim community, I think the very fact that actually this cartoon was published 12 years after the collapse of the Taliban regime shows how important the Taliban and the USA's war on terror has been on recent perceptions of the Muslim community today. So this cartoon looks at the French ban on face veils in public. So here we can see in the cartoon that a mother is covering her child's eyes. So Matt is using humor in order to break down negative stereotypes and perceptions of the fugitive Muslim woman. So actually the reader is on her side, and here he's criticizing this blanket ban on face veils. So, and I think also this kind of goes into the long-standing British tradition of caricaturing the French as having debauched and slightly skewed views towards the female body. Okay, so this next cartoon is quite interesting, and I think actually it's trying to get the reader to question his or her own views towards the face veil, because this comments on the lifting of the face veil by Birmingham Metropolitan College. And it was published 2 years later, 2 years after the previous cartoon that we just saw. And here we see a very young class of about 12 to 13-year-olds being educated in perhaps most likely a Western educational establishment by a Caucasian male. And so it kind of shows how the face veil doesn't pose any barriers to the females being able to be educated, but neither does it pose a barrier to the male teacher being able to teach them. At the same time, I think the cartoon is questioning this attitude, this very British attitude towards tolerance. Do we allow people to wear the face veil, and then, and then we see this situation where actually everyone looks the same, or do we actually pose barriers to that, and maybe have something where we do have limitation on who can wear what? Now, aside from gender inequality, another theme emerges, and that's how the book is perceived as a tool for deception. So this cartoon depicts the then Home Office Minister, Theresa May, and you can tell it's her because she's got her red ministerial box and she's got her leopard print heels. And this cartoon comments on a terror suspect, Ahmed, managing to escape the authorities despite being under very strict measures. And all he did was wear a burqa after he came out from Friday prayers. And May here attempts to replicate that very situation by shirking her ministerial responsibility simply by wearing a burqa. The next cartoon, again, comments on the same situation, but I think from a slightly humorous angle. And I think Matt is amazing as a cartoonist. So now this cartoon comments on the results of a survey for BBC Radio 4, which 1,000 Muslims in Britain were polled on Charlie Hebdo, and 27% agreed with the statement, "I have some sympathy for the motives behind the attacks on Charlie Hebdo in Paris." Now, Brooks picks up on this significant number of Muslims who supported the attack, and he uses the Muslim in a burqa to demonstrate the entire British Muslim community. What's interesting is that he focuses on this minority, so actually 62% of those polled disagree with that statement, and yet he still goes for the 27%. So in this cartoon, the very act of veiling serves to unmask what the person really thinks. By wearing the burqa underneath this vest, it undermines the poll results. There's an insinuation being that one who dresses in such a manner can never be part of that 75%, and that renders the poll results invalid. There's also this expectation within this image of British Muslims having to speak out against terrorist attacks carried out by other Muslims in other parts of the world. Now, this is a final cartoon on Muslim women, and this was published following UKIP's proposals to ban the burqa as part of the 2017 general election campaign, and it features Paul Nuttall, who was the party leader at the time. So it shows how the act of veiling isn't unique to the Muslim religion, and yet it is synonymous with Islam. And I think actually the mistake that Paul Nuttall here makes is one that any one of us in this room can make. If we saw two women cloaked as such, we'd probably think they were Muslim women. But I think also what's interesting is actually how one can be considered more British by virtue of being a Christian. And what's interesting is actually Jennings here depicts Catholic nuns. They're not Church of England nuns, they're Catholic nuns. One is Caucasian, one is African Caribbean. So actually the idea of being British is also very, very mixed and diverse. And I think another crucial point of this cartoon is the fact that actually there's this indication that there's a suggestion that the Christian nun chooses to veil in such a manner. So she is afforded a permissibility to dress as such, and she is honoured for doing so. Whereas in contrast, a Muslim woman doesn't choose to veil as such, and she shouldn't be respected or honoured for doing so. Cool. So now I'm going to look at Muslim men. And whilst Muslim women are disembodied and dehumanized, the kind of opposite is true with Muslim men. So actually, they are given an ethnicity, and they're often wearing ethnic attire, often the sal kameez, which are loose trousers and shirts, worn by many men on the Asian continent. And I think attire and ethnicity are used as visual markers of difference in much the same way as the burqa is for women. What's interesting, though, is that whereas the burqa is specifically a Muslim garment, the sal kameez isn't. So there's this perceived transnational Asian culture within these cartoons. So just briefly, cartoons following 9/11 showed a sense of solidarity with the American public. So the Statue of Liberty, Uncle Sam, feature quite heavily in the cartoons. Now, this cartoon was published during discussions in the House of Parliament about what punitive measures to take against Osama bin Laden and the Taliban regime because of the complicity in the 9/11 attacks. So what's interesting about this is that a common theme within a lot of the cartoons I look at across the communities is that Parliament is seen as the battleground for democracy, which is symbolised by Parliament, against autocracy, and this is what exactly is taking place in this cartoon. The fact that this man is again wearing traditional Afghan clothing suggests he's probably Afghan, but it delegitimizes any opposition to the war in Afghanistan. And I think one of the most troubling aspects of this cartoon is the caption itself. So it views Muslims as parasites so that they contribute nothing financially or otherwise to this country at all. This cartoon is interesting because A, it's aimed at British Muslims, and B, it's in the likeness of the very famous 1914 Alfred Lee poster featuring Lord Kitchener, so during the First World War. So here, Garland is both appealing to and instilling a sense of patriotism within British Muslims. And there's this idea that actually British Muslims are part of the solution, not the problem, in tackling this global terror threat. This next cartoon shows the public reaction to the 7/7 attacks. And I think, whereas we saw with 9/11 attacks, the British cartoonists kind of demonstrated a sense of solidarity, here it's taken a more introspective approach. It's questioning why the 7/7 attacks happened. The very fact that it was borne out by second-generation British Muslims was a massive topic within the media. And I think here Mortimer Moreland is trying to kind of get the public to stop with its knee-jerk reaction of thinking, suspecting every British Muslim was complicit in these attacks and is a potential terrorist. The next cartoon is the government reaction to the 7/7 attacks. And here the man's attire is indicative of his attitudes towards values of freedom of speech, freedom of movement for women, and democracy. And here Tony Blair is literally dragging him into the 21st century. This next cartoon comments on the murder of the soldier Lee Rigby. There is no reference or imagery connecting the attack to the attackers, and I think one of the key reasons is because actually Adebowale and Adebolajo were of Nigerian descent. And what's interesting is actually if they were portrayed as Asian men, as the cartoons we've seen up until now, if the cartoons had done so, it would have been grossly incorrect. And this demonstrates the problems that cartoons face when actual events don't actually fit the stereotypes that they themselves have been perpetuating for a very long time. So this is on Daesh, and whilst the evolutionary metaphor has been used as a way to degrade other ethnic groups such as Africans to depict an innate bestial nature, here there is both an emphasis on his foreign background because of his clothes, he's wearing sal kameez, but also it's the words on his back that are emblazoned that are so key to this image. He's an ISIS jihadist. So no longer is the focus only on his ethnicity, but it's the political ideology that he represents. Therefore, he's explicitly connected with ISIS. So I think, to sum up, basically what these cartoons are saying is that were we to disrobe the Daesh fighter, as in this image, we would see the ethnic man in ethnic attire. And I argue that what these cartoons are trying to say is that the Muslim male is potentially violent, and that is demonstrated by his attire. When he wears a sal kameez, he's showing that he's likely to be violent. When he wears the black balaclava and the black clothing, he confirms that suspicion of being the Muslim barbaric. He is innately violent. And I think there's a move away from ideas and values to actually looking at one's humanity. So the Muslim male moves away from his humanity and becomes a Daesh fighter. Really briefly, just to look at the most recent kind of cartoons in relation to 2017 attacks. So this is Steve Bell on the Westminster Bridge attack. This is the Ariana Grande concert. This is the Tube attack. in September, and this is the Finsbury Park mosque attack. And I think one of the really key things to take away from this is actually there's a move away from looking at the attacker, and it's actually the nature and the response to the attacks. And I think that demonstrates maturity towards this global terror threat that we're facing. Whereas 7/7 kind of focused on the British Muslim community and how one looked like, we're now looking at how we can demonstrate our resistance to such attacks. And I think part of that is Cartoon is trying to keep abreast of public opinion, because it's so instant on social media that actually there's this desire to show resistance. And there's a focus away from them, that is Muslims, to us, which perhaps potentially includes Muslims as well as being victims of such attacks. Thank you.